Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast. My name's Brett, and today I want to ride on the coattails of the recently released Star Wars game, Jedi Survivor, and hopefully shed some light on a part of the game that many people might have glossed over, the Nihil. If you played the game and you're thinking, I have no idea what you're talking about, then I don't blame you. In the game, the Nihil are mentioned maybe twice, maybe thrice, and never more than just by name by Cordova and in Force Memories, despite being a massive driving force behind the plot of the game. Needless to say, past this point are some minor spoilers for Jedi Survivor, but nothing major, I promise. If you have yet to play the game, then you are free to listen. There aren't going to be any major spoilers. I'm just going to reference some of the characters and one of the planets in the game that isn't really a secret. Everything that I'm going to talk about is in the trailers, and so I don't consider it spoilers. But that being said, you can skip forward a few minutes if you really want to stay completely spoiler-free, but that is entirely up to you. Before I get into the Nihil properly, I want to introduce them by what happened in Jedi Survivor because what they accomplished is pretty spectacular, and it's a great precursor to what they're all about. Our story starts in the era of the High Republic, around the year 232 BBY or before the Battle of Yavin. So this is just over 200 years before the events of the original Star Wars trilogy. This was a period when the Galactic Republic was at the height of its power and was in an era of peace, prosperity, and exploration. The Jedi Order was, as well, in a golden age of sorts, looked upon as a beacon of hope and the forerunners of progress. The two factions were like church and state. They weren't legally connected, but they both did work together for the benefit of the other. Because of this alliance and the circumstances of the time, both the Republic and the Jedi were interested in expanding their reach to the Outer Rim, so that they can enforce law and order into an otherwise lawless sector of the galaxy. This ultimately led the Jedi to a planet in the Outer Rim called Kobo, a rather undeveloped world that was rich with resources and often attracted prospectors. It was also far enough out of the way that it did attract some less than reputable sources like bounty hunters, murderers, pirates, the like. A Jedi Master named Dagan Gera was stationed there, and he was determined to make a trip through what was known as the Kobo Abyss, a deadly nebula just on the other side of the planet, so that he could see what was on the other side. Several unsuccessful attempts were made to travel through the Abyss for several reasons, such as lack of vision, unpredictable obstacles, and storms within the Abyss that would destroy ships. Dagan Gera, however, being strong in the Force, was able to make an uncharted flight through the Abyss, and was rewarded with a new planet, which he would call Tanalorr. Dagan created a flight path and created a compass that would aid navigation through the Abyss and help others reach Tanalorr. With the help of another Jedi Master, Santari Khri, along with some other unnamed Jedi, she and Dagan Gera were able to begin building a temple on Tanalorr with the intention of it being a base of operations for the Jedi in the Outer Rim. Being a planet that was nearly inaccessible to those who didn't have a compass like Dagan's, it was an ideal location for a temple since it was unlikely to be attacked by the lawless factions of the Outer Rim. Until the Nihil once again got in the way of the Jedi's work by dropping a fleet out of hyperspace on Tanalorr's doorstep. At this time we knew that there were at least 3 Jedi Masters present on Tanalorr, but we can assume that they had numbers in the dozens, including a bunch of Padawans and Jedi Knights. Using estimates from Wikipedia, there were about 10,000 Jedi at the time of the Purge in 19 BBY. So about 200 years prior to that, during the height of the High Republic, I would guess that there were probably 13 or 14,000 Jedi in the Order, but no more than 15,000. Given the state of the Temple on Tanalorr and the Jedi's interest in setting an outpost up in the Outer Rim, I think it makes sense that there might have been a couple dozen stationed in the area, but I wouldn't say that there were more than maybe 40 or 50 at the time. And that is a very high estimate. I would say there was maybe 1 or 2 dozen on the planet at most. There were a lot of Jedi in the universe at this time, but the Outer Rim was a relatively new exploration, and I don't think that they would have dedicated more than maybe a few hundred total to the area. And that includes the entire Outer Rim. The 3 Masters that we know were there, of course, were Dagan Gera, Santari Khri, and Oppo Rancisis. And I cannot just glaze over the absolute unit that is Oppo Rancisis. Even though he has very little to do with the episode, I want you to pause the episode and look up a picture of this man. Oppo Rancisis. I'll wait. You got it? Okay, now that we're on the same page, He looks like the love child of Gritty and a Chinese emperor from like the Jin dynasty, with a beard that Gandalf only wishes that he had and claws that Freddy Krueger would look at and say, man, you need to get those looked after. This is the peak physical form that any of us could hope to achieve, and it sets an unrealistic standard for men to live up to. None of us will ever be as great as Apo Rancisis. He was trained by the Jedi Master Yaddle, the only other of Yoda's species that we see during the movies. He was on the Jedi Council during the High Republic and survived the initial Great Purge in 19 BBY. This man is several hundred years old, and why are we not talking about him? Bring him back. I need 6 seasons in a movie based on Apo Rancisis, and I will not stop until we get it. And now that little embarrassing bit of fanboying is out of the way, we can go back to our regularly scheduled program. As mentioned before, the Nihil managed to slip through hyperspace and get a fleet onto the front door of Tanalorr. The Nihil, with a small fleet in orbit, began attacking the temple. The Jedi Order was contacted and very quickly gave the order to abandon the temple and destroy the compasses, as so to cut their losses in an already losing battle against the Nihil. Dagan Gera, having founded the planet, felt very betrayed by this notion, and he refused to leave. Unfortunately for him, he was cut short and put in a bacta tank for a nice 250-year-long nap. So that brings us properly to the topic of the show, the Nihil. Who were they, and why did the Jedi Council order the temple to be abandoned as soon as they heard the name? And more importantly, how did they get through the Kobo Abyss with a small fleet? So let's start with the first question. Who were the Nihil? The Nihil were a group of marauders, simply put, and a well-organized one at that. And by well-organized, I don't mean to imply that they got along with one another as a group, but rather that they had solid leadership and a proper structure. They were, above all else, anarchists who had one goal in mind: instill fear through reckless acts of piracy and terrorism. The word Nihil means nothing in Latin and is similar to the word nil in English. You may have heard the phrase aut Caesar aut nihil, which in Latin means either emperor or nothing, or more figuratively, all or nothing. You may have also heard of nihilists, which is the belief that life is meaningless and rejects any generally accepted norms of human existence such as knowledge, morality, or meaning. But as the great Walter Sobchak once said, these men are nihilists and there's nothing to be afraid of. Although, unlike nihilists, there was plenty to be afraid of when it came to the Nihil. Founded by the Rowe family in 382 BBY and initially led by Marda Rowe. The Nihil was part of a group called the Elders of the Path, at first, who were a fragmented group split from the Path of the Open Hand, who believed that no one else should wield the Force, especially the Jedi Order. The Rowe family kept this belief and used the Nihil as a means to see it through. However, their main objective was not necessarily to kill Jedi, but to cause general chaos and instability. With the Jedi coming into the Outer Rim, it was just convenient that the Nihil were able to target them. Early in its conception, the Rowe family had heard of a woman named Mary Santeca, who is a Force-sensitive human that had an uncanny ability to detect what she called paths through hyperspace, and was a huge proponent in hyperspace travel being as developed as it is. During this time, hyperspace was still largely misunderstood, and safe lanes were still being discovered to shorten travel over long stretches. Mari was able to use her gift to propel her family into infamy, and brought immense weight to her family name in both renown and wealth. Somewhere around 330 BBY, the Rowe family kidnapped Mari and used her to chart paths for the Nihil. She was kept alive and used for over a century in a medical capsule where she was kept secret from the rest of the Nihil. Her ability is a little hard to explain, but basically she just navigated hyperspace lanes through the Force, something that not many people were able to do. So, having Mari's paths, the Nihil were able to use the hyperspace lanes that no one else knew about, including the Jedi and the Republic. This gave them an immense upper hand, and it meant that they could pop in and out of hyperspace seemingly at random or at impossible locations, giving them the element of surprise. See, hyperspace is tricky and there's still a lot of mystery behind it. Even in present-day Star Wars, it's still a little bit of a finicky subject that people don't fully understand. What we do know is that hyperspace was an alternate dimension that could be reached by traveling faster than the speed of light and entering a form of molecular displacement. Being an alternate dimension, however, doesn't mean that it was cut off from what we're going to refer to as real space. Objects such as planets, asteroids, and other celestial bodies, as well as ships, were also present in hyperspace as shadows, as every physical object in real space had a counterpart in hyperspace. That means that if you were to hit one of these shadows in hyperspace, you would be pulled out of hyperspace and collide with another object in real space. This is why the paths were so important to the Nihil, and so detrimental to the Republic and the Jedi. The best way that I can think to describe this is to imagine that you're in a forest, and that there's a winding path that leads through to the other side. You can't just cut through the brush because it's too thick and you'll end up likely hurting yourself or dying. So you have to go from point to point on the set path to get to the other side. That makes sense, right? You only know one way to get to the other side, and anything other than that is dangerous and impractical. And then there's someone else who knows the forest like the back of their hand, and for the sake of this comparison, maybe they live in this forest. This person can see all sorts of shortcuts through the forest that are off the beaten trail, because they can see something that you can't. They know where to walk through the brush where they'll just scrape by and come out unscathed, and they can beat you to the other side every single time because they can go through points that you can't see. So this is what the Nihil had. With the Republic's understanding of hyperspace, you could predict where someone was going to come into a system with the knowledge of existing hyperspace lanes. Think of these as highways. If the Republic wanted to catch a fugitive or catch a fleet off guard, they could basically camp at the end of a hyperspace lane and intercept them. Although what made the Nihil so difficult to deal with is that it wasn't possible with the Nihil, as they were using different paths that the Republic didn't know about. The Nihil would find new paths to come into the systems and come in behind or to the side of the waiting fleet and catch them by surprise. So you can see how this might pose a significant threat to an era of peace. The Nihil was passed down from generation to generation in the Ro family, and eventually to Asgar Ro, down to Marchion Ro. So during the time frame where the attack on Tanalorr happens, Marchion Ro is at the head of the Nihil, and that's who the Republic and the Jedi are contending with. And this era is kind of where we're going to draw most of our information from, since that's where the books are set. The Nihil had a very definitive theme, and they went really hard with it, and the theme was anything to do with storms. The association with storms didn't come from nowhere, though. It wasn't just an edgy thing that they decided was really cool. The family that founded the Nihil, the Ro family, were Evereni, and were from the planet Everon. Everon was a planet that was constantly ravaged by storms, and they attempted to live in harmony with nature and even control these storms. However, a great storm came in the form of a vortex that rose from the planet's core, bringing strong winds and lightning, destroying the native Evereni civilization. This caused the Evereni to scatter and caused a series of century-long conflicts in the aftermath that were fought among the Evereni for the remaining resources following the Great Storm. This brought them to near extinction, forcing those who survived to flee the planet around 500 BBY and kind of branch off into their own thing. So the Ro family using storms was a callback to their home planet. As such, their insignia was 3 red lightning bolts. Continuing with the theme of storms, their ranks were structured by dividing into groups that were called Tempests, which were led by a Tempest runner. Paneta, Lorna D, and Kasav Miliko were the Tempest runners under Marchion Ro, who was called the Eye. Get it? It's like the Eye of the Storm, because they really like storms. Anyways, the Nihil below each Tempest runner were, in order of most to least important in the hierarchy, storms, clouds, and strikes. The Nihil were very big on promoting from within. Higher ranks were often people that started out as strikes. So the strikes would recruit new blood, and if they had enough recruits under them, then they would become a cloud. Clouds would become storms if they gained enough reputation. And what constituted a reputation was a little convoluted and pretty subjective. But because everyone wanted to be the best, like no one ever was, there was a lot of infighting. And that commotion was encouraged, because you get a promotion through means of showing that you are the biggest and the baddest. It wasn't necessarily easy to rise through the ranks and become a storm, so taking out a rival cloud was often the best way to get some clout and rise up. So strikes had to constantly get new blood in because they were basically killing each other all the time. So there was no particular fashion or uniform that the Nihil adopted. But each member would typically dress like their Tempest runner and had their rank displayed somewhere on the garb, which was signified by white lightning bolts. Strikes had 1, clouds had 2, and we can assume, although it's never said, that storms had 3 lightning bolts, but 3 lightning bolts were also the insignia of the Nihil, so maybe they didn't go with 3. But anyways, for example, Lorna D was an introvert who wore minimal clothing, and her Tempests typically followed suit. They would keep their intentions close to their chest and were often conniving and roguelike. Paneta was a man who fancied himself, well, fancy, and they dressed a bit nicer than those in Kasav Miliko's Tempest, who were known for being chaos gremlins. Pan's Tempest liked to come off as the smartest in the room and was often precise with their planning, while Kasav's were often out doing drugs and getting wasted, and probably looked like what you'd expect a raider in Fallout to look like. But while every group looked a little different from one another, they all wore some kind of mask, obscuring their faces while they were out pirating. These masks serve a multitude of uses and weren't just necessary for obscuring the person's face from whatever crime they were committing, but we will go into that a little bit later. It was important to the overall flow of the Nihil that each Tempest was unique in some way. Everyone had their own niche, and there was a different Tempest suited for different jobs. If you wanted brute force, then you might have considered Kasav. Maybe you needed some discretion, and you would choose Lorna, or maybe it required meticulous planning and execution, and you would lean towards Pan. It was the little things like this that made the Nihil so dangerous. Because they were multifaceted, it was hard to know what to expect, and they were suited for pretty well any job. People living in the Outer Rim started referring to the Nihil as demons and spirits, because once they got attacked, there was nothing you could do to stop them from getting what they wanted, or destroying what they couldn't have. On top of that, having the paths made them unpredictable, giving them more credence as spirits. Above everyone else, though, as mentioned before, you have the mastermind behind the entire operation known as the Eye of the Nihil, or the Eye of the Storm, or the Eye, or whatever you want to call them. That was Marchion Ro. The Eye was the only one who had access to the paths given by Mari, who was in such a state that she was unaware that she was being tortured daily to grant her gifts. The Eye, however, was not an absolute position of power like you might think. Like I said before, the Nihil are very anarchistic. Marchion Ro would give suggestions and advice as to what their next moves were, but it was up to the Tempest runners to decide what they did with those suggestions. To Marchion, the Nihil were divided in chaos. He saw their potential with the paths and their numbers, but he couldn't convince anyone really to see his vision through, for the most part. But when they were making decisions on what they wanted to do, they did put things to a vote. If a decision were to be put to a vote amongst the Tempest runners that involved using the paths, the Eye's vote counted as 2, which meant that in a tie, the vote would always go in the Eye's favor. Tempest runners didn't necessarily need to vote to tell their Tempests who, what, and where to raid, but they did need to consult with other runners and the Eye if they wanted to use the paths, since the Eye was the one supplying the paths. Such votes took place on what was known as the Great Hall, which was a giant Durasteel platform floating in the middle of no space. It had no walls, no ceiling, but it had an invisible vacuum shield dome surrounding it that kept in oxygen, and we can assume that somewhere on the platform was a gravity generator, since the Great Hall wouldn't have been large enough to make its own gravitational pull. Only the Nihil knew how to get there with the use of paths, which also added to their mystery to those in the Outer Rim. No one knew where they came from or where they went to after their raids, making them very difficult to track down. At the Great Hall, no blasters were permitted, and would have to be kept on one's ship. However, bladed weapons were permitted. The main deck was a large feasting hall which consisted of tables and the like for the Marauders to party it up after they returned from a raid. There was a structure at the far end that served as a private area for the leaders of the Nihil and was guarded by 2 killdroids. The structure held docking mechanisms, an airlock, and a small complex of rooms. This, however, was only to be used by the Eye and the Tempest runners. While the Great Hall was fortified, it was nothing but a glorified hunk of steel floating in no space. Like I said before, there were no walls and just the shielding to protect it from an attack, which left the Great Hall vulnerable to attacks, if anyone managed to get to them. And there was one point where a group of Jedi managed to storm the platform, and they got in with relative ease, because, again, no fortifications. After they would go on raids, money was split evenly, and you can't see it, but I am air quoting very heavily. Every Nihil that took place in a raid would be compensated, but it was far, far from even. The Eye would take 1/3 of the spoils from any raid, that included using their paths, and the Tempest runners would take a much larger payout than their Tempests got. They had a rule of 3 when it came to payouts, and it isn't explained too much in depth, but this is kind of what I gathered from it. The Eye gets 1/3, the Tempest runner or runners that were involved in the raid got 1/3, and the Tempests were given the other third to split among their members. The entire point really was to line the pockets of the Tempest runners so that they had no reason to take arms against the Eye. If they were getting rich beyond measure from these raids, then they had really no reason to quarrel and attempt a coup. The other marauders below the Tempest runners were not in the know of the payout system, and it was largely believed that the Nihil were helping them, but the reality is that the Nihil was helping itself, and the marauders were doing the busy work to get next to nothing. When you break it down like that, it sounds like, yeah, well, basically any job here. So it's good to know that I'm being treated like a marauder at my workplace. Oh, that's an interesting thought. There isn't a lot of information about their numbers, but we do have one concrete number from the official Star Wars website which states that each Tempest had upwards of 150 members, but that number is incredibly vague and it doesn't really make sense for the scale of the operation. If each Tempest had around 150 members, then that would mean that there was a total of around 450 members. I would guess that their numbers are in the thousands, possibly, but I couldn't find anything to back that up, and here's kind of why I think of that. Obviously, being a marauder group that relied heavily on traveling through hyperspace, the Nihil had quite a fleet. Their ships were unique in that they looked like they were designed to punch ships rather than attack them from a distance. To anyone but the Nihil, their fleet looked brutal and ugly, with blocky frames and spikes protruding seemingly at random, with the group's sigil haphazardly painted on like war paint. People have described their ships as looking like a giant spiked fist floating through space, ready to physically crush their enemies as opposed to the aesthetic starships of the Jedi or the classic designs of the Republic fleet. This design served both as a means to intimidate and separate themselves from other fleets. If you saw these ships, you knew that it was a Nihil, and that instilled a fear, like they wanted. So their fleet typically consisted of 5 main ship types. Strike ships, which were small crafts piloted by 2 strikes. Cloud ships, larger crafts for transporting clouds and strike ships. Storm ships, which you can see that their naming convention was a little unimaginative, but the storm ships would have been a little larger than the cloud ships. There were the spider cruisers, which were, again, unimaginatively named due to their spider-like appendages, and then there were the corvette-sized flagships that the Tempest runners rode in. Aside from those, there was one more ship called the Gaze Electric, and it was the flagship of the Eye. It was larger and more imposing than the Tempest flagships, which was described as a flying fortress with a shadow like that of an ocean predator. Each ship was equipped with the ability to shield their ships behind a storm cloud-like effect upon entering a star system, which hid them from plain sight and other ships' sensors, allowing them to further gain the element of surprise. They also had an ion cannon-like weapon that would completely shut down ships on impact. So this might seem a little off topic, but with such a fleet, it's hard to imagine that their numbers were only in the hundreds. If we go off the numbers for the CR-90 Corvette, you could technically crew it with just 7 people, but that is a skeleton crew that is doing nothing but flying the ship and getting it from point A to point B. A competent crew for the CR-90 was somewhere around 50 people and up to 165 depending on the configuration of the ship. Since the Tempest Corvettes were mainly used for battle, you would have to assume that they have a higher crew number. So even if they were running on that baseline minimum of 50 people for competence of flying the ship, that would be 150 people just dedicated to running the Tempest ships. So that leaves about 300 other members that were flying other ships. And we know that the strike ships need 2 people, so, you're basically having your numbers at that point. Now, we don't really know the full size of the fleet, but I would love to hear from someone who knows more on the matter about crewing starships than I. Maybe those numbers are accurate. I mean, they are from an official Star Wars source, but I just find it hard to believe that they would have that few people. But I digress. On the ground, the Marauders were equipped with at least a blaster and a knife. Some of them carried more weapons. But beyond the use of brute force, the Nihil like to take advantage of the Geneva Convention not existing in the Star Wars universe, meaning that war crimes were maybe differently defined. And as such, they really like to use chemical attacks. So because the Marauders all wore masks while raiding, they all had filters attached to those that would filter out the chemicals and allow them to breathe through their attacks. One such chemical weapon was a blue-gray gas that was thick and dense like a storm cloud, and instantly filled the air with a poison that made breathing feel like inhaling fire. That's kinda messed up, but it was very effective, and the use of chemical warfare allowed them to take on larger groups because they could kind of incapacitate larger numbers of them with chemical attacks and take them by surprise. So to sum up their group, they are basically a bunch of marauders and pirates that use a brutalist aesthetic to inflict terror and rely on the element of surprise and the use of special hyperspace lanes known as paths to operate. So now that we know a little bit more about the Nihil, let's go over some of the havoc that they sowed under the leadership of Marchion Ro during a period where he convinced the Nihil to strike against the Jedi directly. This is where we'll kind of tie it in to the beginning where we were talking about Tanalorr. So, again, back to the beginning, around 232 BBY, the Nihil caused what was known as the Great Hyperspace Disaster. Because the Republic hadn't dealt much in the Outer Rim at this point, they saw the Nihil as a small-time pirate group and largely dismissed them as being a threat. In the Outer Rim, there were a lot of pirates, and if they took them all seriously, then they wouldn't have enough resources to focus on literally anything else. There's a reason why the Outer Rim was as wild as it was, and this is largely why. So during this time, the Republic and the Jedi were working together to build what was called the Starlight Beacon, which was a giant space station situated in the center of the region's unexplored zones that sent out a signal to guide travelers to better navigate the Outer Rim. And we'll get back to that one in a second. I'm sure you guys love hearing that by now. So to cause the Great Hyperspace Disaster, Ro ordered a storm ship be sent on a path that intercepted a known hyperspace lane, something that had yet to be done, and this was in the Hetzal system. A freighter known as the Legacy Run crossed paths with the storm ship and was torn apart trying to avoid the unexpected ship in their hyperspace lane. Now, there was no reason why this had to be done in the Hetzal system. Ro just needed to create a crisis that would bring the Nihil to the attention of the Republic. It was mostly just convenient. Fragments of the destroyed ships exited hyperspace and started to rain down on the planets in the Hetzal system, threatening to tear the planets apart. This caused the necessary panic that Ro wanted and brought the Jedi to the system in an attempt to navigate an unprecedented disaster. Some pieces of the fragmented ships continued in hyperspace, however, causing what would be known as the emergences. The first emergence happened in the Abdallah system, where one fragment hit the planet and resulted in 20 million deaths. 20 million from one impact. So, this is a pretty big deal. Meanwhile, there was a growing number of emergences elsewhere in the Outer Rim, which caused the Republic to entirely shut down hyperspace lanes until the situation was dealt with. Because if another legacy run happened, then they might be screwed. So, while the Nihil was an outlaw group, Marchion Ro did have dealings and spies within the Republic. He learned that the Nihil were being targeted as the root cause of these events. This eventually resulted in a number of confrontations between the Nihil, Republic, and Jedi, such as the Battle of Kur. Here, the Nihil managed to injure and cause severe PTSD to Jedi Master Sskeer and killed Master Jorah Mali. But in the end, the Nihil were scattered by Jedi forces who believed the Nihil to be destroyed, and this worked very much in their favor. There was a large event happening called the Republic Fair, which was a great work put on by Chancellor So of the Republic to let the people of the Republic know that they were safe, having succeeded in recovering from the Great Hyperspace Disaster. The Nihil had been busy with botany, in the meantime, planting seeds of a carnivorous plant-like species called the Drengir across the Outer Rim, with the aim of distracting the Jedi while the fair occurred. The Nihil, once again, had the upper hand when their plan worked overall, and some of the more prominent Jedi were taken away from the fair to deal with the Drengir infestation. The Nihil attacked the fair in this confusion, killing hundreds of thousands while spreading a giant cloud of toxic gas. The Nihil destroyed several ships as well as the sky islands known as the World Pavilions, which were constructed to represent the different planets of the Republic. The Republic Fair being an event that was supposed to calm and help people understand that they were safe, I imagine this was pretty detrimental to that. Eventually, the tide of battle turned against the Nihil and they were forced to retreat. Paneta ordered a bombardment of the fair with the Nihil still on foot, injuring Chancellor So in the process. With the planet being carpet-bombed, the Jedi were forced to deal with the flagship themselves and stop the bombing, and force the Nihil into a full retreat from the planet. Hilariously, the Jedi marked Tempest Runner Lorna D as the leader of the Nihil, as she was the only one they saw in a commanding position leave the invasion. Marchion Ro had a little bit of an ego, and I'm sure this pissed him off a little bit. The Jedi launched what they called Operation Counterstrike, a global operation to wipe out the Nihil. Later, Marchion Ro would launch a broadcast to the galaxy naming himself as the leader of the Nihil and asserted himself as the controller of the galaxy. That is a bold statement, sir. And eventually the Nihil would infiltrate the Starlight Beacon and set a bomb that caused the station to fall out of orbit and onto the planet of Erim. The Starlight Beacon was effectively the Republic's attempt to get a hold on the Outer Rim, and this was a massive blow to them and the Jedi as well. There's no mention of when the attack on Tanalorr happened within the events, but I assumed it happened around the point of the Starlight Beacon. The Jedi knew who the Nihil were, and they ordered a very swift exit from the system because they knew what the Nihil were capable of, especially on a relatively new planet with hardly any defenses. There's a large gap in their operations past this point, and I imagine they'll probably fill it out with some more books, but we know that the Nihil will scatter in the next 100 years or so. Mari San Tekka, their path navigator, died somewhere around 231 BBY, just after the events of the attack on Tanalorr, the Starlight Beacon, and all that, meaning that the Nihil could no longer generate new paths, and lost a large part of their competitive edge. So much so that in the Imperial era, they were nowhere to be found. Scattered as they may have been, their legacy lived on. They were recalled in the centuries to come as a force to be reckoned with. In 0 BBY, there was a warlord named Bernium Ro, who led a group of marauders who used the same imagery and rhetoric of that of the Nihil. And the warlord even shared a surname with the founding family. Whether or not he adopted that as an homage or there was some sort of relation, we don't really know. At this time, Grand Moff Tarkin sent a group to destroy Ro and his operation. 3 years later, in 3 ABY, a fellow by the name of Bael Deruyet, and I am sure that I am taking my daily dose of butchering some pronunciations, but alien names are, a thing. This fellow acquired an incomplete Nihil path engine, and publicly announced that he was going to use it to usher in a new era of lightspeed travel. It was, unfortunately for him, incomplete, and he couldn't get it functioning before it garnered enough attention that the Empire went after him to take the technology for themselves. However, it was incomplete, and nothing ever really came of that, just, some mild terror attacks. But being incomplete, it didn't have any consequence, nothing was done with it, and that was that. And with that, the Nihil's legacy, officially, comes to a close. Obviously, there's more that happened during this time, and there are several books worth of information that go over the various battles and the Great Hyperspace Disaster. If you want a nice light read, I would really recommend checking out the books from the High Republic era. There's a little bit of flack on them because people don't really like the young adult style novels that they are, but I found them quite interesting. I think that the High Republic era is super cool, and the fact that the books are so easy to pick up and put down means that they're really great, honestly. I can't recommend them enough. But aside from that, what do you think? Do you think that if Marchion Ro weren't so hellbent on upsetting the Jedi that the Nihil could have lived on by keeping a lower profile? Or do you think that they would have eventually died due to infighting? You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media or podcast websites. You can also find us on YouTube, where we seem to be thriving. And remember, if a space pirate invites you to join Marchion's Fury Road, then you should go home and rethink your career of selling death sticks in your local cantina. Until then, see you next time.